Hi everyone, I'm Andy and this is the AI Breakdown. Welcome to your weekly news edition, where I'll cover what happened in AI last week and why it matters. Let's start with the story that ended up swallowing the week. Anthropic's clash with the Pentagon over a $200 million contract has gone from awkward negotiation to something much bigger, and if you listened last week, you'll remember we were already talking about how defense, procurement and AI were getting uncomfortably tangled. Well, that knot just tightened. The dispute was over language in a Pentagon contract that would have allowed Claude to be used for any lawful use. Anthropic's CEO, Dario Amodei, wanted explicit limits around domestic mass surveillance and fully autonomous weapons. This was especially consequential because the deal had already made Claude the first major AI model deployed on the government's classified networks. The Pentagon revised the wording on the 26th of February. Anthropic still said it wasn't enough, and after a hard deadline set by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth passed on February 27th, President Trump directed federal agencies to stop using Anthropic products, with a 6-month phase-out for agencies like the Department of Defense. That would already be dramatic enough, but then came the bit that really made people sit up. The Pentagon designated Anthropic a supply chain risk. That's a label usually associated with foreign adversaries, and it's the first time a US company has ever been given that designation. Fortune also reported that the ban triggered a bit of a whoa moment inside the Pentagon when leaders realized how deeply Claude was already embedded in classified systems, which means this is also a procurement continuity headache for contractors and government-adjacent buyers now reassessing compliance and backup plans. Anthropic says it will challenge that in court, and Amodei put it bluntly in the Defense Post, saying, "We have no choice but to challenge in court the Pentagon's formal designation of the firm as a risk to US national security." OpenAI moved fast and announced its own classified systems deal with the Pentagon the very same day. Sam Altman said that deal includes safeguards around surveillance and autonomous weapons, though critics were quick to point out that these were broadly the same protections Anthropic had wanted written directly into contract language, and that's really the heart of it. Not whether safeguards exist in spirit, but whether they're formal, enforceable, and visible when the stakes are this high. What really turned this into a national AI story was the consumer response. A campaign encouraging people to bin ChatGPT took off across Reddit and X. People started sharing migration guides to Claude, and Anthropic's app climbed to the #1 spot on Apple's US App Store, overtaking ChatGPT. Anthropic said daily signups hit all-time records every day that week. Free users are up more than 60% since January, and paid subscribers have more than doubled year on year. This unexpected surge caused Claude to crash out and become unavailable for a while. For anyone running or buying AI, there are two very practical questions here. First, where do you draw the line on government work? And second, what happens when your ethical position collides with procurement reality? My view is that this is bigger than one contract. Anthropic is effectively testing whether trust can be a business model in AI. In the short term, that may cost them federal revenue, but the user response suggests ethics is starting to behave like distribution. It can win attention, loyalty, and switching behavior. If that holds, every AI company will have to treat policy choices not just as compliance issues, but as product and brand strategy. Whether that compensates for lost federal revenue is another matter. This episode is sponsored by Notify Technology, a health and safety software partner helping teams run incident management, audits and inspections, and risk assessments in one place. And with Notify Spark, their AI companion, they're streamlining incident reporting and investigations, saving time, reducing admin load, and helping teams act faster on what matters. Learn more at notifytechnology.com. Now, while Anthropic was in a very public argument with Washington, OpenAI went in almost the opposite direction, with a product launch, enterprise push, and formal IPO prep all at once. On March 5th, OpenAI released GPT 5.4. On paper, there are a few notable upgrades, 3 variants, a context window of up to 1 million tokens in the API, and better reliability numbers, with OpenAI claiming it's 33% less likely to make errors in individual claims then GPT 5.2 and 18% less likely to contain errors overall. It described the model as its most capable and efficient frontier model for professional work. Useful, yes, but the part that really matters is computer use. For the first time, OpenAI's main frontier model can interpret what's on a user's screen and directly control mouse and keyboard inputs. So this is no longer just a system that drafts an answer in a chat box. It can navigate desktops, browsers, and software on your behalf. OpenAI says it set record scores on OS World Verified and Web Arena Verified, and hit 83% on its internal GDP val test for knowledge work tasks. If that works reliably in practice, it's a meaningful shift. A lot of enterprise AI projects have got stuck not because the model couldn't reason, but because the work itself lives across messy old interfaces, multiple portals, and software that was never designed for clean API access. So this is the bridge from AI as a tool you prompt to AI as a worker that operates your tools. That's why this launch matters more than the usual benchmark chest thumping. It points toward AI acting less like a clever assistant and more like a junior operator who can actually move between systems and get the task done. Data entry, pulling reports from clunky portals, QA testing, updating records across platforms, these are real jobs, and there are a lot of them. Then there's the corporate backdrop. OpenAI has reportedly hired Cooley and Wachtell Lipton to prepare for a public listing targeted for late 2026, likely in the October to December window. It also hit $25 billion in annualized revenue at the end of February, up 17% in just 2 months, though it still doesn't expect profitability until at least 2030. But back to the main story, and from a practical standpoint, computer use is the glue to transition from AI that advises to AI that acts. And if you're thinking about workflow design in your own organization, this is the bit to watch, not because it means humans disappear, but because it changes the shape of the tasks you can sensibly automate. Continuing with the model layer, Google made the week more challenging for those charging premium rates for routine AI tasks. Google released Gemini 3.1 Flashlight in preview on the 3rd of March, aimed very squarely at high-volume workloads. The headline is the pricing, 25 cents per million input tokens and $1.50 per million output tokens. That's about 1/8 the cost of Gemini 3.1 Pro. It's also fast, with artificial analysis benchmarks showing 2.5 times faster time to first token and 45% faster output speed than Gemini 2.5 Flash. This model supports multimodal inputs, up to 1 million tokens of context, and output up to 64,000 tokens. Google says it topped 6 benchmark tests and beat GPT-5 Mini and Claude 4.5 Haiku on equivalent tasks. As ever, benchmark caveats apply. Real-world quality is what matters. But even allowing for that, the commercial message is obvious. Google is telling developers and enterprise buyers that not every workload needs an expensive frontier model. In fact, many don't. Translation, moderation, UI generation, simulations, high-throughput classification, these jobs live or die on unit economics. And these are exactly the kinds of jobs where per-token cost is the primary constraint. If the model is good enough and dramatically cheaper, that changes the maths very quickly. That's why I think this one matters beyond just Google Cloud customers. We're watching a shift from model prestige to model pricing. For a lot of embedded AI features, nobody gets extra points for using the fanciest model if the margin disappears. Flashlight makes more use cases viable simply because the cost floor has dropped. My read is that this will force responses, maybe not immediately, and maybe not with identical pricing, but the direction is clear. Routine AI workloads are heading toward commodity economics. The competition now isn't only who has the smartest model, it's who can make good enough intelligence so cheap that it becomes the default choice. The other big strategic story this week came from China, and it's worth paying attention to because it frames AI in a completely different way from the West. China's new 15th five-year plan mentions AI more than 50 times and puts it right at the center of national economic strategy. The plan includes an AI plus action plan to integrate AI across manufacturing, healthcare, financial services, agriculture, education, and national defense. It also calls for hyperscale computing clusters, scalable quantum computers, an integrated space-Earth quantum communication network, and investment in things like humanoid robotics, 6G, brain-machine interfaces, and nuclear fusion. That is a very broad shopping list, obviously, but the underlying point is simple. China is not treating AI as something businesses may or may not adopt depending on budgets, internal politics, or whether last year's pilot went badly. It is treating AI as a state-directed layer of economic modernization and technological self-reliance, and not just as economic policy, but as a national security imperative. For multinational firms operating in China, that suggests future AI requirements may be less optional than many Western companies are used to, particularly around data handling, model sourcing, and technology transfer, if this plan turns into specific mandates. And for US and European firms, it sharpens the contrast. In the West, adoption is still largely market-led and messy. In China, it is coordinated from the top. My own view is that China is making a very different bet from the West. It is optimizing for national capability, and that can absolutely create waste, but it can also build advantages in deployment speed, supply chain alignment, and strategic sectors where market-led systems often move too slowly. So the mistake would be to judge this plan only by whether every project is efficient. The more important question is whether it gives China a compounding advantage in actually operationalizing AI across the economy. Western analysts have generally taken it seriously, in part because China does have a track record of using 5-year plans to push real industrial change, and this one makes very clear that AI is now being treated as core national capability, not a side industry. Switching gears, one of the more interesting signals this week came out of Hollywood. Netflix has acquired Interpositive, the AI filmmaking startup founded by Ben Affleck, and I think this tells us something useful about where AI is actually landing in creative industries. Interpositive builds models trained on a production's own footage. The company had reportedly been operating in stealth since 2022 with a 16-person team, which gives this a bit of an acqui-hire feel as well as a product play. The tools can relight shots, change color, replace backgrounds, add visual effects, and fill in missing shots in post-production without going back out for reshoots. Affleck is joining as a senior advisor to Netflix, and the deal also includes a first-look arrangement with Artists' Equity. Now, after the last couple of years of AI anxiety in film and television, you could imagine this story landing very badly, but Netflix was quite careful in how it framed it. Elizabeth Stone, Netflix's chief product and technology officer, said, "Technology plays a part in how stories are made, but people and their ideas, craft and judgment remain at the core of great storytelling." That wording is doing real work. It positions the tech as part of production, not as a substitute for writers, actors, or directors. And commercially, the appeal is pretty obvious. Reshoots are expensive. Post-production delays are expensive. And Netflix is exactly the kind of company where even modest efficiencies repeated across a huge slate become strategically meaningful. My take is that this is the pattern to watch across creative industries more broadly. AI gets adopted first where it removes production friction, not where it tries to replace taste. In that sense, Netflix may be showing the more realistic commercial future for AI in media. Less synthetic art, more invisible workflow leverage. It's also notable that this came just days after Netflix reportedly dropped out of the bidding for Warner Bros. Discovery, which makes the move look even more like a choice to build in-house technical advantage rather than buy more traditional media assets. Before we finish, there's one update from last week's infrastructure arms race that's worth pulling out. We talked about hyperscalers, spending eye-watering sums on compute and power, and this week Meta added a very concrete number to that picture. Mark Zuckerberg has now confirmed Meta will spend $600 billion on US AI infrastructure through 2028, including $135 billion in 2026 alone. That includes the Hyperion project in Louisiana, a 2,250-acre site designed to deliver 5 gigawatts of compute power, and Prometheus in Ohio, which is expected online in 2026 and powered by natural gas. The other part of the story is the chip deal. Meta and AMD have announced a multi-year partnership worth $60 billion to deploy up to 6 gigawatts of AMD Instinct GPUs, with shipments starting in the second half of 2026. The first deployment uses custom GPUs tuned for Meta's workloads, and AMD also granted Meta a performance-based warrant tied to deployment milestones. That matters because it's one of the clearest signs yet that NVIDIA's grip on AI compute is being challenged at the hyperscaler level. According to Meta and AMD's own announcement, Meta is ultimately targeting more than 1 million GPUs for its next generation of AI models. So this is not a token second supplier arrangement. It's deep core engineering and serious capital. My view is that Meta is playing the long game here. If you want to lead in AI, you can't just rent your future quarter by quarter. You secure land, power and chips years in advance. The risk obviously is overbuilding, but the signal is unmistakable. The infrastructure race is intensifying, and the people with the deepest pockets are trying to lock in optionality now. Right, let's rattle through a few more before we wrap up. First, cybersecurity. AWS detailed a campaign in which a financially motivated, Russian-speaking threat actor used commercially available AI tools, including DeepSeek, Claude, and the open-source CyberStrike AI platform, to compromise more than 600 FortiGated devices across 55 countries between the 11th of January and the 18th of February. There were no 0 days involved, just weak credentials and exposed management interfaces exploited at scale. AWS's conclusion was striking. A low to medium-skilled individual or a small group was able to carry out an operation that would previously have required a much larger and more specialized team. That is the part worth pausing on. AI is lowering the skill barrier, which makes basic security hygiene more important than ever. Second, politics. A super PAC called Leading the Future has built roughly $125 million to influence the 2026 midterms, with AI regulation emerging as a live campaign issue in races like New York's 12th district. What makes it especially interesting is that the industry itself is split, with Anthropic-linked backers supporting Alex Bores, while OpenAI-linked and venture-backed money lines up against him. Apparently at least $10 million of that war chest is earmarked to oppose Bores specifically, which tells you this is not just abstract lobbying anymore. AI policy is becoming an electoral conversation. Third, the states are not waiting around for Washington. Oregon has passed SB 1546, which requires chatbot operators to disclose when users are interacting with AI and adds protections around self-harm and child use, including reminders every 3 hours that a companion chatbot is not human. It also gives individuals a private right of action with $1,000 statutory damages. So this is the kind of rule that can force actual product changes rather than just sitting there as symbolic legislation. Utah and Vermont also moved new AI laws this week, just as the federal deadline for the FTC and Commerce Department response arrived. Colorado, meanwhile, pushed back implementation of its broader AI Act to the 30th June 2026, which is another sign states are both moving fast and already adjusting in real time. That patchwork is getting denser, not simpler. And finally, the macro number. Gartner now projects global AI spending will hit $2.52 trillion in 2026, up 44% year on year, with infrastructure still swallowing the biggest share at $1.37 trillion. The bit I found most useful wasn't even the total though. Gartner says AI is sitting in the trough of disillusionment, which sounds a bit miserable, but really means buyers are getting more practical. In Gartner's framing, that shows up as AI being sold more often through incumbent software vendors as bundled features rather than standalone projects. Less moonshot theatre, more bundled features, more scrutiny, and more pressure to prove value. That's all for this week's AI Roundup. If you found value in this breakdown, please leave a rating and hit subscribe. See you next week.